The people have had their say. Well, at least 0.25% of them. And the result is that Britain now has a Prime Minister who calls black people pickaninnies, gay people bum boys, and compares Muslim women to letterboxes. If we are to take him at his word, he is also quite prepared to take the UK into a no-deal Brexit. Democratic, perhaps. Worrying, definitely. Tonight on Tysky Sour, we discuss our next Prime Minister and whether Britain can survive Boris Johnson. To do so, I have an all-star panel tonight. I have Faiza Shaheen, who is Director of CLASS. What does it stand for again?
Centre for Labour and Social Studies. But it was definitely one of those where they were like, we want to call it
They got the acronym first
like,
and then they filled it in afterwards, right? And you're also Labour candidate to replace Ian Duncan-Smith in Chingford and Wood Green at the next general election.
Yeah.
Woodford Green.
Yeah.
I should have got that right because I'm from around the corner, but what can you do? I'm also joined by Jonathan Fortes, who is Director of Economics and Public Policy at King's College London, but was also Chief Economist at the Cabinet Office, so a top civil servant. You know everything really about the workings of government, so I'm sure we'll go into that at some point during the show. I want to start with a basic question. So we're going to go on in a bit to what it means or what Boris Johnson will be doing as Prime Minister. But first of all, I want to ask a more basic question, which is what does it mean about modern Britain, about Britain in 2019, that we have, or we're about to have, someone so divisive, careless, unqualified become our Prime Minister? I'll start with you, Faiza.
Well, it doesn't mean anything good. Here we are with another Etonian Bullingdon Club man as our Prime Minister, someone that has failed and failed and failed again, and has managed to fail upwards because he is a very privileged, posh, white man, and he's managed to get away with openly racist remarks, with being incompetent, like you say, and being a liar. You know, talking in this way, which is just like pure bluster. I get called out every time I don't say my T's, and this man says nothing. He just goes on and on like total bluster and umming and erring. And he gets to be Prime Minister. So, you know, what it says is, unfortunately, we still live in a country with huge class inequalities. We still have an idea of what power looks like, which is an old idea of what power looks like, an old Etonian. And there's a lot that we need to change.
I want to stick on that point very, very quickly, because you're someone who talks about or studies and writes about class inequality a lot. I mean, when we talk about class inequality in Britain, we often talk about friends in high places helping out friends in high places, which I'm sure has happened in Boris Johnson's life. But at the same time, something that's kind of odd about him, or potentially not odd, but notable, is that his class privilege seems to have helped him in the electorate at large. Does Britain love posh people?
I think it does. I mean, when you look across the number of prime ministers that have been elected that went to Eton, it's one tiny school. I think we're on like the 16th prime minister that went to Eton. And I think we do have a view of what power looks like. And even those of us that are from more working class backgrounds, because we're so used to seeing prime ministers and senior politicians look and sound a certain way, we can't imagine anything else. So, you know, people find it sometimes quite hard to imagine me as a replacement for Ian Duncan-Smith, for instance, because he ticks a lot of boxes, right? He's posh, he lives in a manor in the Shires and, you know, says his T's and, you know, here I am. Like, so they can't, even though they might want it at some level, they just don't take you as seriously, because for centuries we've been told that power is a rich, white, posh man like Boris Johnson. So it's disappointing. I mean, you know, it wasn't that long ago that Cameron was David Cameron. It feels like a long time ago, but David Cameron, another Etonian Bullingdon boy.
At least he gave an impression of sort of basic competence, right?
Well, the impression. But look where we
exactly.
are.
Jonathan, what does it tell us about modern Britain that this man, Boris Johnson, is about to become Prime Minister?
Well, first, I mean, full disclosure here. Obviously, I don't think I'm particularly posh, but I'm a privileged white man. And indeed, I was at college with, not at Eton, but I was at college at Oxford with Boris Johnson. I should also be clear, I didn't know him.
So we're not going to get any...
Didn't know him? Oh.
I have nothing useful to say on a personal level. And I wasn't a member of the Bullingdon Club and wasn't in that particular set.
But that's a massive difference, though. There is a big difference. The Etonian Oxford Bullingdon Club, there's a certain type of, you know, that's an elite crew.
Yes,
it's not the same to have just gone to the same college as him.
But it is quite interesting, and sort of moving away from Boris Johnson. We can come on to talk about what he means for us politically. But of course, you know, one of the interesting things is, I don't disagree with anything Faiza said. But I from my perspective, as somebody who's always been, I went from Oxford to the Treasury, to directing a research institute, to becoming a senior civil servant, to working in Edmonton, directing a research institute, and now to an academic position. I've had a privileged life. I think I've worked for it, but I've clearly had a lot of privileges, and I'm clearly part of the establishment and part of that, privileged white man set. But equally, the establishment that I'm part of is quite different from the Boris Johnson part of the establishment. It's a bit more meritocratic. My friends are not politicians for the most part, or at least if they are, they're politicians like, I don't know, Ed Balls and Yvette Cooper, people who actually have worked to get where they are, whatever you think of their politics or their ideas. My friends are people who were senior civil servants. They're actually from ethnically a relatively diverse background. People like Minouche Shafiq, who runs the LSE, or Sharon Wright, who runs Ofcom. All of these are people from my generation who are absolutely part of the establishment, right? You wouldn't say Minouche or Sharon are not part of the establishment. They're from.
There are different degrees, though, aren't there? So there's a kind of...
Well, you have to...
Boris Johnson is so posh, he can get away with being a complete idiot.
I think the point is that there are overlapping circles, and without wishing to say that we, my type of establishment person, are perfect, I think we do have a sort of both a basic competence and respect for truth and facts. And that, to me, is the big difference between Boris Johnson and the sort of establishment conservative that you would have got 10 or 15 years ago, is that this idea that you can get away with as Pfizer says, simply saying things which aren't true and laughing it off. The idea, so when recently the Daily Telegraph printed in one of Boris Johnson's columns, he made something up. He made a statement that was simply false, and somebody complained to the Independent, the Press Standards Authority, and said, you need to print a correction of this. And the Telegraph's defense was not that this was what Johnson said was true, but it was that that anyone reading it would naturally take what Boris Johnson said
with a pinch of salt.
More than a pinch of salt.
Wow.
That it was subjective, and this was simply a statement of fact. It was X% of people in a recent poll said X, and they hadn't.
And this man is our Prime Minister.
So we're printing political fiction, so it's
Telegraph's
okay.
defence was literally nobody believes that anyone reading a column goes to a column by Boris Johnson for facts. So of course we weren't misleading anyone, because everyone knows that he makes stuff up. Effectively, that's what they said. And the idea that any Prime Minister of any party or even of any background could have got away with that 10 or 15 years ago. And I mean, we'll come to talk about this no doubt, the sort of, is Boris Johnson Trump? No, he's not. He's very different from Trump in lots of important ways. But that sort of Trumpification, that normalization of lying and saying things which simply aren't true, and thinking that you can get away with that in politics, is something which, in the 25 years I was a civil servant, working for governments of both parties, I just don't think it was there.
How different do you think he is? I want to ask you first, as someone who's been in the civil service, right? So with the Boris Johnson-Trump comparison, what was said a lot when Trump became president was that he was a danger to the system, as it were, and there was a lot of talk about the American deep state sort of trying to contain the more extreme elements of Donald Trump. And Boris Johnson has one element of that to him, the way that he's quite gung-ho with the idea of taking Britain off a cliff into a no-deal Brexit. I want to talk technically more about what no-deal Brexit will mean later, but just in terms of the fact that this is someone who doesn't seem to play by the rules. Do you get the sense, and you sort of gave that introduction as well, about how there are two different types of establishment. Is there a part of the British establishment that's quite scared of a Boris Johnson prime ministership, or do you think they think it's all just a game and a show, and actually he's going to do basically what he's told, or he's going to stay within the rules, basically?
They're absolutely scared. I don't think they know any more than we know, and as you say, we'll come on to this, so I don't think they know.
So lots of your friends are worried about it.
I don't think that the idea that civil servants thought Johnson was an absolutely, unbelievably, not just bad, but irresponsible foreign secretary, That's common knowledge. I don't think I'm giving away any confidences when I say that, and that therefore they're terrified as how he would behave as prime minister. Absolutely. Equally, it's probably fair to say that, look, he did a lot of things wrong as mayor, but London is still here. He wasted a bunch of money on the Garden Bridge, but look, that's not abnormal political behavior. He did not, do completely crazy things with the governance of London. So
I love London is still here. That'd be a really good reference on his CV.
Yeah, it's all right because London's still here. That's like, that's low bar. It's all right. I could be incompetent.
It was a bit better than that. TfL kept on working pretty much as it did under Ken Livingstone, because the people who ran TfL under Livingstone stayed on and ran it under Johnson, and they did a perfectly competent job. And he didn't stop them from doing that. He came up with mad ideas like the floating island airport, which never happened.
The Route Master buses. I just got one. It was so hot.
He did.
Hot buses. It's not exactly. When Donald Trump got elected, people were like, "Is this the end of American democracy?"
Yes.
Whereas
it's not the same as throwing kids into camps. By
I do want to make a really serious point here because, today when I said it out loud, Boris Johnson is our prime minister. I mean, I guess officially it's tomorrow. And even saying it then, there's this like horrible like feeling in my heart. And for people of color, for gay people, for all of the people that he has openly, not just been rude about, but, put down, been racist, been homophobic, the fact that it's still okay for someone that doesn't see us at the same level, that doesn't see us as, the same human beings as others, is our prime minister, is really painful and hurtful. And I think that feeling here, as it was in America, is similar, because we do have a racist prime minister now. I mean, Theresa May herself deported black people and the rest of it, and she had very racist policies. But to have, it just goes to show it doesn't matter what he says, that for some people, and 90,000 plus that voted for him in the Tory party, they thought that's fine.
Yeah.
And and the fact that so many people will still vote for him if there's a general election, just is upsetting. And I think that's similar.
So it's more what it tells you. Well, obviously he hasn't been elected yet by the UK electorate, but we know he is relatively, he's not that unpopular. Yeah. So it's what it tells us about the electorate that they're
willing to forgive racism and homophobia. That for them isn't a deal breaker. And I think that is similar to Trump.
Let's talk about how he's going to govern. So, I mean, for me, it was quite a drab leadership election, at least once it got down to 2. And I don't feel like any of them committed to anything that was particularly surprising, other than tax cuts. So Boris Johnson is saying he's going to raise raise the threshold for the top rate of tax from £50,000 to £80,000. It's going to cost the Treasury, I think, £9 billion, and it's going to only really benefit the top 10% of people, or with the top 10% highest incomes. And he's also talked about high-speed broadband for everyone. Other than Brexit, do you see that as the limits of his domestic policy? And you think that's doable? He's presumably going to need a chancellor who's a bit more relaxed about the purse strings than Philip Hammond to do all of those giveaways.
I mean, he's going to choose a chancellor, so he'll choose a chancellor that will try and push that through. I mean, to what extent that will be able to be pushed through Parliament? I mean, it's a bit like what happened with Theresa May when she came in and she had like these grand plans, and then she just got caught in Brexit. To the extent that he'll be able to do anything else, I think is very questionable. I mean, he's got even a smaller majority than she had, especially with this by-election in Brecon. So I don't know that he'll be able to do any of that, but it was a good line because it was bribery for Tory voters. And what you do get from him, like the comment he made about proudly saying that he stuck up for bankers in the financial crisis, is that he is a traditional free market, trickle down conservative politician. He hasn't learned anything from the last 40 years of neoliberalism. He wants more of it. And that's extremely worrying for any type of Brexit plan he would have, because if his idea is that you get some kind of no-deal Brexit through, open up the markets, make tax cuts, and that's the way in which you get through, that is going to be bad for inequality. And as someone who's spent my career working on inequality, that the fact that those are his values says what direction he will want to go. And really, the only hope is that he can't do any of it because he just doesn't have a majority. But
Jonathan, in terms of domestic policy, what do you see as Boris Johnson's project, and is any of it doable?
I don't think. I mean, again, without necessarily disagreeing with what Pfizer said, I think to say that he has this sort of consistent free market views, I think is frankly, are those, to the extent that he has views, are those views probably what he has? Yes, but as I've forgotten which Marx brother it was who said it. Yeah, but if you don't like those views, I have others.
Yeah.
Right. In domestic policy terms, he will pursue the path of least resistance that he thinks is most likely to make him popular, and layer on top of that a few grand projets along, like Boris Island and Heatherwick buses and the Garden Bridge. And frankly, actually, rolling out high-speed broadband across the country is probably less wasteful and more useful.
Yeah.
It's not a bad idea.
Quite
right?
a lot of other things that he could spend tens of billions of pounds on. So if he thinks that's a vote winner, it's not, for me, not the end of the world. But I think, in the short term, Pfizer's absolutely right. He won't be able to do any of this, and it'll be dominated by Brexit. If there is a no-deal Brexit, there will be he will, and in macro terms, is not crazy. There will be a very expansionary budget which showers lots of money on everybody.
Let's do Brexit properly in a moment. First of all, you're watching Tysky Sour. You're watching Novara Media. As you know, this organisation is only possible because of your kind donations. If you are already a subscriber, thank you very much. You are what makes this possible. If not, please go to support.novaramedia.com. You know our ask is for the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. Please like this video on YouTube. It means more people see it. Keep your comments coming. Share it on Facebook. Share it on Twitter. And also, I'm going to say, we want more people to tweet about this, because we love your comments in the chat section, but obviously the only people that see those are the people that are already here. So if you tweet while we're live with a hashtag Tysky Sour, I'll be checking your tweets as we go on, and those comments will be introduced into the show, as long as they don't contain anything too rude about myself or anything like that, and then I'll just ignore them. I'll block you, in fact. But we will still be taking your questions from the chat at the end. All right, Brexit. So Boris Johnson has said, at least, he is willing to countenance a no-deal Brexit if that's the only way to get us out on October the 31st. I want to start with you, Jonathan. I'm still, as someone who's engaged in politics, reads a lot about Brexit, it's still so abstract to me what no-deal Brexit means. I still don't, in a way, I almost want it to happen just so I can find out. Because at the moment, it just seems so, ethereal. How should we understand what no-deal Brexit would mean?
First of all, I have to say, full disclosure, you're not the only one, because from an economist point of view, it would be wonderful. It would give us, give us all material for dozens of papers. It would be a real shock to the system. And we have no idea how a large, developed, complex, interconnected economy like the UK would deal with this overnight. So what is it? It's a big overnight shock to by far our largest and most important trading relationship, that with the other countries of the EU. So what it would mean in that sense is that there would be immediately new tariff barriers, and more importantly, customs controls and other regulatory barriers between us and the rest of the EU. So this would lead to disruption to trade. It would also, because over the last 40 years companies have become used to the fact that barriers are low or non-existent between us and the rest of the EU, and have therefore built up supply chains and production processes and so on that are dependent on those relatively easy connections, it would disrupt all of that. So there would be this quite significant disruption to trade. What impact that would we're not sure. What I would say though is that some of the more apocalyptic predictions, trains not, planes not flying, truckers not being able to drive back and forth, because the EU side has put into place some unilateral temporary measures to ensure that won't happen. Those apocalyptic predictions will not take place. So I think the idea that we're going to run out of medicines, or we're going to starve, or there's going to be rationing, or that planes won't fly. Those are exaggerated. It will be a shock. It won't be apocalyptic, but it will be a pretty significant shock. So that's the economic side. And then the other big area where it's going to be a big deal, which will not have, from an economic point of view, is very much third order, but in political and human terms is really important, where we really don't know what will happen, is in Northern Ireland and on the Irish border, where I think it's very hard to say what will happen, except that there will suddenly have to be a border where there was no border, and we all know the political implications of that.
Do you think there's a danger of people in, so your two professions, which is sort of like academic economics, and prior to that sort of in the civil service, do you think people have, I'm just blown their load. I couldn't think of a different thing to say in terms of scare stories, in terms of saying the next thing that happens is going to be a disaster if you make the wrong decision. I feel like they made predictions which were overly catastrophic before the 2016 referendum, and
now no one believes them.
Yeah, now no one believes them.
I think on the whole, economist predictions about what would happen after the 2016 referendum haven't been that too far off. What the Treasury did, unfortunately, under George Osborne, was take the economist predictions, then dial them up, and then put a bunch of political spin on it, which in retrospect was damaging. I think it was damaging at the time because people saw it as political spin, and they were right. I said before the referendum, I thought there would be negative economic consequences, but I also said what George Osborne was saying was scaremongering, and it was scaremongering, and that backfired. It backfired before the referendum. It certainly backfired both on him, but also on sadly on us economists and civil servants after the referendum. And yes, I do think there is a danger with no deal that people say, oh, it's going to be apocalypse on day one. And I don't think it is going to be apocalypse on day one. It's going to be a shock, and the effects will mount up over time. But it would be, I think, quite damaging for those like us who think no deal is a really bad idea and very much not in the long-term interest of the UK. To try and sort of say, oh, you should vote, you've got to stop no deal because diabetics will be dying like flies because there'll be no insulin. I do not think that's going to happen.
We're an advanced capitalist country with reasonably good governance, so people aren't going to die of diabetes. I mean, we can, we'll get the insulin. We'll find a way.
To do it, yeah.
Pfizer, I want to use. I feel like you implied a bit earlier that potentially there is. Grace Blakely talked about this as well in the New Statesman, a sort of disaster capitalist plan. So if Boris Johnson almost celebrates going through with a no-deal Brexit because that gives him the opportunity to slash regulations, to slash taxes, and really, I suppose, mount a project from the right. Do you think that's a real possibility? I mean, another way of framing that is, what's your worst-case scenario?
No, I mean, look, any policy is slanted towards the values and opinions of the people that are implementing that project. Now, Brexit, which I never liked. It could have been a more of a compromise project. It could have been something that is done with a big investment in regional inequalities, for instance, and to tackle some of the problems we've had in the last 40 years. But what we've got is a prime minister that would be happy, I think, to have these trade deals that will put certain public services on the table, maybe the NHS, someone who won't care about selling out the Northmoor, won't think about inequality in their policy decisions. So you can see that very clearly. The two main white papers that were put out while Theresa May was Prime Minister, you do a control find in there, you don't find the word inequality or poverty once. So in their whole execution of Brexit, they're not thinking about us, actually. They're not thinking about the underlying issues that brought us Brexit, the real entrenched problems that we have that are actually undermining the economic function as well. Because when you have such huge regional inequalities, when you have parts of the country where basically people's productive capacity just is not being supported or is not flourishing, then we're not being the best that we can. And so for me, it's like, well, Brexit could have been a different type of project, but what we'll have, if we have Boris Johnson, if we have like Priti Patel, if we have, is a kind of the economics of which I won't like, but also the political part of it, potentially what they might do on immigration, the way in which this country will look like we are turning in on ourselves, that we are being small-minded, that this is some kind of little Englander project, which it has been, the Nigel Farages. If those people have the biggest say in what the Brexit no deal looks like, then both economically and politically, it's regressive.
I actually disagree with that.
Yeah?
It was quite interesting. The Brexit Party put out a set of actual economic policies as opposed to Brexit policies a couple of weeks ago, and they're actually, if you look at them, they weren't crazy, but more to the point, they certainly weren't this sort of neoliberal disaster capitalism. They were more money for the regions, invest in skills, and that's because the Brexit coalition is the elite coalition, maybe people who want the UK to be like Singapore or whatever. But most of the people who voted Brexit are people who want...
But why would you have any trust in a Boris Johnson, Priti Patel, Sajid Javid, like Dominic Raab? These people, Liz Truss, these aren't people that have in any way supported a kind of public investment project.
I don't have any trust in any of these people at all. I don't have much trust in the rest of the political class at the moment. But I think particularly with Johnson, who has, we're not talking about an ideologue here, right? We're not talking someone who has a great ideological project to turn Britain into Singapore. Johnson's project is to be Prime Minister and to stay Prime Minister, right? And if the if the way of doing that is to maintain the Brexit coalition by appealing to people who actually want some degree of regional redistribution, some degree of protectionism in one form or another, more regulation. I'm sure on the whole, I'm probably more.
Who's been really vocal about that on the Brexit side? You're right that some of the Brexit policies, and they've come out with that quite recently. But when I meet them in TV studios, they're not vocal about those things. What they're vocal about is we leave on 31st October. That is the thing that they care about most.
That is the thing they care about the most. But if you want to keep that coalition together afterwards, what does that mean in terms of public spending and tax cuts? It was noticeable, I think, that the Brexit Party thing, 5-point plan didn't contain any mention of tax cuts at all. It was all about public spending and reorienting things. And then, of course, remember on immigration, things switch quite the other way. The ultra liberals that you talk about are actually pretty pro-immigration. And while I have a great deal of sympathy for what you said before about Johnson versus May in terms of what they said and perhaps what it says about us collectively as to what we're willing to tolerate, the fact is that in terms of actual concrete policies on immigration,
so you think they would protect freedom of movement, or?
I don't think that any post-Brexit government, if Brexit actually happens, that
even Labour would struggle to keep that.
But do I think that a post-Brexit government led by Boris Johnson is going to be more or less liberal on immigration policy towards the world as a whole than one led by Theresa May? By miles. I mean, the one thing Theresa May...
She had it in for immigrants.
Neither, in their very different ways, neither May nor Johnson are ideologues. May believed in one thing and one thing. May, from an ideological point of view, May believed in one thing and one thing only, which was reducing immigration. Really, it was the one thing she really, really cared about.
Yeah.
From an ideological point of view, not clear Boris believes in anything, but to the extent that he does have any sort of principles, they're vaguely liberal on immigration. And he did support an amnesty for irregular migrants who've been here a long time while he was mayor of London. And moreover, it's relatively easy to do that when you're mayor of London. He said it again during the Conservative leadership contest, which actually I was surprised and encouraged by. He has already dropped the migration target, and seeing which the way the wind is blowing, other ministers like Jolly to fall in.
I think one way in which it will work out, because when any kind of trade deal is struck with the rest of the world, I mean, all of India, China, all of these guys are going to say visas, so they might not have any real say in it. And depending on who's around him, they might not block it if they're not as anti-immigration at their core, like Theresa May. But still, is the rhetoric going to be there? Is is he going to...
There's also, there's a possibility, right? And this is the optimistic vision of Boris Johnson for Liberals, which is that because Theresa May was a Remainer, she had to overcompensate and she had to talk about citizens of nowhere. She had to be very hard on migration, etc., etc.
She believed that long before the referendum.
Yeah, she did believe that long before
along.
That's true.
I don't think those excuses held any water. They may on some other aspects of Brexit, but on immigration, she was always as hardline as the most hardline Brexiteer.
That's true. Yeah, that did seem to be a bugbear of hers.
Yeah,
but in any case, there's an argument that Boris Johnson will end up being quite liberal because that's who he's got to make an effort with now, because he's done the whole Brexit thing, because he's seen as a true blue Brexiteer. He can sort of relax about that whole element, whereas Theresa May was quite insecure about it. And what he's actually got to do now is prove to the electorate that he's the Boris Johnson of London, of when he was a London mayor, which was quite liberal. So you could see a Nixon goes to China both, right? on migration.
In a way, that's what Boris Johnson has got going for him, is that he can kind of be both. Like, he can be the London liberal and he can also be the hardcore Brexiteer. And he's, because he does change his mind every 5 minutes and he does write, one thing one week and the other another week.
And people forgive him because that's part of his persona. Whereas any other politician, if they were to do that, people would think that's a bit off. Whereas with Boris Johnson, he's allowed to have two characters because that's his.
I hope and think it'll be harder as Prime Minister to get away with that.
Hope, right? So he might have to choose one side or the other, and that will be interesting to see play out. And what we do know from several different sources is that he's incompetent and he's prone to gaffes. So many people today, someone saying to me in the office, like, he's gonna get shown up, but he's gonna get exposed.
It's a risk.
Yeah,
let's hope so.
Yeah.
Let's go on to his first choice for Brexit. So his stated first choice for Brexit isn't a no-deal Brexit. It's that he goes to the EU and he, unlike Theresa May, threatens a no-deal, and they believe that he's actually prepared to do it. And this negotiating style gives him more bargaining power, and ultimately the EU say we prefer to modify the backstop or take away the backstop or give this guy something to take back to Parliament if that avoids a no-deal Brexit, largely because of the damage it will do to the Republic of Ireland. So that's his line. That's what he's been arguing throughout the leadership campaign, and that's what his outriders have been saying throughout the leadership campaign. Do either of you think that is plausible, that strategy will work for him? It would be an electoral coup if it does.
Short answer, no. He can go to Brussels and get some cosmetic changes. He'll then have to decide whether to come back and say, this is a triumph. They've backed down in the face of my aggressive negotiating, and now he should pass this deal. He could try and do that. I think it's unlikely because I think it'll be so obvious to people that all he has secured is cosmetic changes. The EU 27 have been pretty clear and consistent throughout this. I don't see why they should. There's no pressure on Ireland to back down. Ireland are better prepared for a no-deal Brexit than we are.
Is that true?
Yeah, Ireland have actually.
They've been working on it.
They've been working on. They're very competent. They've done they're serious. If you contrast their no-deal preparations with ours, they're serious. They've got alternative scenarios in their budget projections. They've set aside some money. They've been handing out loads of free consultancy advice to small business on how they should deal with it. They have alternative ferry routes in place. It's still going to be really tough for them, and they certainly don't want it. But they've done their homework, and they're not you've got a minority government. The position of the government is supported across the political spectrum by the vast majority of Irish voters. And but the government itself, more broadly, is quite fragile. And in that situation, why would you back down politically? It doesn't make any sense.
This is about him wanting to create political drama. Ultimately, I don't think he can really get them to budge. Like you say, it might be some cosmetics changes. But the idea the backstop will go, which both candidates said, it was amazing. And so, what he wants is some kind of face-off with Brussels, which will neutralise the Brexit party to some extent, because he can show I'm the big Brexit man and, I'm standing up for Britain and these guys won't let it happen. And in any case, the EU, they read British newspapers. They know that Parliament isn't going to let this happen, or at least will block it in every way possible. And so why would they give in, even if they believe he could do it, which I believe he could do it, they're going to look at the rest of the Parliament and know that they wouldn't let him bring that kind of destruction to the UK economy. So, quite rightly. And so, they're going to be looking to UK Parliament. And then what he'll do is have some face-off with Brussels. Then he'll have some face-off with Parliament, because then he'll try and pursue a no-deal Brexit. At that point, then, he's shown that he's neutralised the Brexit party. He really believes in the project, that everyone's trying to stop him. For me, that's the point at which he says, right, general election or whatever, because I don't see what else plays out. I just don't see him getting his own way, either in Brussels nor in Parliament.
Because I think potentially the most likely outcome is he goes there, he gets cosmetic changes, a very compliant media who at this point is a little bit worried about a no-deal Brexit, although it would make for some good, comment pieces. It would be good for journalism as well as for economists and political science, actually, just in terms of people buying more newspapers. But that would be a sort of somewhat mechanical conspiracy theory I had to go for, that they backed Brexit purely to have something to write about. But I think it is quite possible that he gets a cosmetic deal, comes back to Parliament. The ERG at this point are a bit more willing to fall in line, because they trust Boris to negotiate the next stage, whereas they didn't trust Theresa May to do it. You've also got a lot of Labour MPs who now seem completely fatigued by this whole thing and are willing to vote through anything.
And they're hearing on the doorstep, like, we want Brexit.
Well, that's what Stephen Kinnock said on Politics Live. If the same deal comes back, I'll vote for it. Lisa Nandes now seems to be suggesting it was a mistake not to vote for it the first time round. So I feel like there might be enough people to put through basically Theresa May's deal plus cosmetics.
The big thing will be like how ERG takes it. And it's true that, Boris Johnson, as opposed to Theresa May, might be able to push through something that looks pretty similar. The thing is that if there's any kind of backstop, DUP won't fall in line. If you can see that it's a very fragile situation, the extent to which Labour might be able to whip enough, it would be very, very close. And still, there's some real purists in the ERG. They're real purists. They will still turn on Boris, some of them, not all of them.
I agree with Pfizer, and I think Pfizer's scenario is the most likely. And to add to that, they will also have the people who voted for it the first couple of times will also have pressure from the Brexit Party, because the Brexit Party would like nothing more than the scenario you've outlined. That would be the perfect scenario.
They won't neutralise the Brexit Party.
The perfect scenario for them. They can turn around and say, look, we told you so. Not only did Theresa May sell you down the river, but Boris Johnson is selling you down the river too. Yeah. You want real Brexit, it has to be us. They'd love it.
And then Tories are going to be really hurt, because I hear it on the doorstep, right? People are like, well, Tories, where they are Tory Brexiteers, they're like, we're going to vote for Nigel Farage.
So you both think October general election, because Parliament won't tolerate a no deal. Is that a prediction?
Anyone who tells you they know what's going to happen doesn't know what they're talking about.
I said but
central scenario, yes.
I think it's a definite possibility that they call an election.
They're all a possibility. Obviously, it's about which one's most likely.
If I had to bet on one scenario, I'd bet on the one that.
And ultimately, in any case, there's nothing that they can really push through because of the way the numbers are in Parliament. So every road leads to a general election, and it might not be autumn, but certainly I don't see how they get through to spring. And we'll
talk about electability in a moment. I want to read out some of these tweets. So we've got Shartimus in brackets, stay classy. I've been on the cusp of panic all day watching people say, well, we've survived so far about Boris becoming PM, when my family's clung to life by our fingernails so far. I'm a disabled carer, and since 2010, we've been homeless 3 times. I'm terrified. Well, solidarity.
Yeah.
Really feel for you there. We've got some questions, which I won't be taking until the end. ECG says, get watching tonight's Tysky Sour on Novara Media with the brilliant Faiza Shaheen if you want straight knowledge up in your veins. Phil BC says, it's Tysky Sour hour. Tune in and listen to Faiza Shaheen and JD Ports talk about Boris Johnson and what we can do about it. Let's talk about Boris Johnson as a political opponent, as it were. I get the impression you review particularly like him. Obviously, you're talking from a Labour perspective, and you're from a perspective of... do you want to remain in the EU? I know you're part of the UK and the changing Europe.
We're neutral. Our job is to provide analysis. We're academics. We just spectate and comment.
Yeah.
I've been clear on my views on that. From an economic point of view, it's clear that leaving the EU will do some damage. a lot of uncertainty on how much to the UK economy, and people ought to know that. But that doesn't mean people aren't, that it's illegitimate in some way to want to support Brexit. But my job is to analyse the economics and to some extent the immigration and labour mobility points of issues and what the consequences of our choices are, whatever those choices are.
It's worked well, I think. Faiza, I think every Saturday you're talking to people on the doorstep in Chingford and Woodford Green.
You came.
I came. That was over a year ago now, wasn't it? I'll come again.
September, yeah. You're just down the road as well. What's your excuse?
I know, I don't have any excuse. On the doorstep. So you're speaking to voters all the time. You're in
every Saturday, yeah.
You're in a marginal constituency.
Marginal. So Ian Duncan Smith won by about 2,400 votes last time, and interestingly, it was only just slightly Remain. So I think it was something like 50.9%.
Also, proper bellwether. So do you think?
So it's really interesting.
Does Boris Johnson becoming Tory party leader make your job harder or easier?
So interestingly, it came up a little bit on Saturday on the doorstep, and so there's a number of us that go out usually. I'm very lucky. I've got great volunteers. Thank you to my volunteers. There's usually about 15.
You're allowed to do a shout out. How do they join you on there?
Yeah. So
follow Faiza Bachin, and then you can join her on the Saturday morning to canvass in Chingford and Woodford.
No, it's super interesting just speaking to people about where they are. It's like a focus group every Saturday. I'm from a geeky researcher background myself, so I just called you a geek then. That's really rude of me.
I'll take it as a compliment.
So the thing that's coming up is that, Boris is like Marmite. So some people that would traditionally would have voted Tory but aren't hardcore Tory. They don't like Boris Johnson. And so they are put off by it. And then there are others. They're not people that would have ever voted for me anyway. So, but there are others what are like hardcore Brexiteers, and they want Boris and they're excited about it. And what's interesting and what's happened in Chingford and Woodford Green is how many people on the doorstep who formerly voted Conservative say they don't know. So, and that don't know group is a combination of Tory Remainers and Tory Brexiteers. Now, Boris to the Tory Brexiteers is like, okay, now I might vote Conservative if he takes us out. But the Tory Remainers don't like Boris Johnson. So, it's not clear cut.
Do you feel like you can gain any of those Tory Remainers?
Yeah, I think it's possible. Partly because I have such a difference of opinion with Ian Duncan Smith on everything on Brexit. But also because I'm a local candidate and I grew up there, and, I think there's a sense of like, what about that? Maybe we could have someone that represents us that actually lives here that we bump into in the park. So, I think there's different reasons I could appeal to them. But at the very least, they might just not vote Tory or not vote. And that's what I'm hearing. And those people don't like Boris particularly. So, I think it will vary across the country, but at least in Chingford, Woodford Green, it's mixed. It's mixed. He is Marmite. Yeah.
Jonathan, Tories weren't the only party to get a new leader this week. The Lib Dems, Jo Swinson became their leader. Who do you see as becoming the most effective opposition to Boris Johnson, Labour or the Liberal Democrats?
Well, I think, at the moment, and this is one reason why, despite the fact that there's probably a small Remain majority in the UK, why Boris Johnson could well win the sort of election that Faiza was describing, which is that, for various reasons, which I won't go into now, there are a lot of people who will never vote anything but Labour, and there are a lot of people who just won't vote Labour. In that broad Remain camp, which is a bit more than half of the country, it is quite split. And so, if Remain want to win, Remain collectively, that majority in the slight majority in the country, which I think probably would, on balance, prefer Remain to a no-deal exit, want to win that election, they're going to have to get their act together. And unfortunately, it's quite hard to see that happening in the current political, given the current way that Labour and the Liberal Democrats have stacked themselves up.
It is going to be, Faiza, do you think so the next general election basically is going to be, can Labour get more Lib Dems or can the Conservatives get more of the Brexit Party? And at the moment, it seems easier for the Conservatives to get more of the Brexit Party than it seems for the Labour Party to get more of the Lib Dems, which does make it look like Boris Johnson, on those purely mathematical terms, would win the next general election when it comes about.
I think that's true to some extent. The way in which I see that play out locally with voters that say to me that I'm considering voting Lib Dem is I say, look, this is a 2-horse race here, and it's Ian Duncan Smith or me. And you know that I've voted Remain. I talk out about Brexit every week on the TV. And in that scenario, you can win some people round. I mean, there's obviously the ideologues like hardcore revoke right now, and they're just not going to vote for Labour. But given that Labour has moved to a second referendum campaign for a Remain position, which we need to be much more vocal about, then I think that you can win some of those people round. It's just the work isn't being done right now. The big thing, of course, is, and people forget this, a lot of political commentators forget this because they're not out every week speaking to people. I'm telling you, out of the doors that we knock on, Brexit is maybe like the 5th or 6th on the list in terms of the issues that come up on the doorstep still. So anyone that thinks that you can walk into this a general election and either be hardcore Brexit no deal or bollocks to Brexit and nothing else matters is wrong. They're just wrong, because people are still, the number one thing that's coming up for me is crime, it's schools, it's housing, it's my water bill, so those things all come up before Brexit. Now what does come up, and this is related to Brexit, is just this sense of like, I'm just disillusioned with the whole thing. I don't know who to trust anymore. And I feel like everyone's lied and I just can't make sense of it. Now that, for us on the left, with our movement and with the people that can go out and knock on doors, those are the people we need to energize and make them believe again that there is a possibility to have politicians that are principled, that, do you want to do something different, that are going to listen to them. So there's a lot of work to be done. We're in an era of like political flux. So we can't be sure of any outcome. Yeah.
Right, I'm going to move to questions in a moment. So start asking questions. I'm going to start collecting them while I'm collecting questions. So I'm going to look to you both like I'm staring at my laptop in an odd way for a few minutes. I want to go back to a point earlier where you said that, and I want your civil servant hat on here, that the Republic of Ireland were quite well prepared for no deal and the UK government is not. And I think to many people from the outside, it has looked like the UK government, both in Parliament, both in Downing Street and in the civil service, has really struggled these past 3 years. Why, I suppose in very simple terms, why is it that Ireland have got their act together and Britain hasn't?
Well, I think a lot has to do with, and this is the problem, a lot of problems in government. You can plan for disasters that come out of nowhere, but it's very hard to plan for government policy going wrong, because in some sense you're not allowed to. Remember, civil servants weren't allowed to plan for the government losing the referendum because it wasn't policy to lose the referendum. So actually, if you look at the way the government plans for a big flu epidemic, or I don't know, a meteorite wiping out Leeds, we're quite good at that sort of thing, because if those things happen, it won't be our fault. But a responsible government plans to prepare for them, and our governments do plan to prepare them. Government hasn't planned for no-deal Brexit, because no-deal Brexit has been such a bitterly divisive topic within the cabinet that you've never been able, you can as a civil servant, you can be appointed as the national director. There is a national director for flu, I think, or there has been in the past anyway, and you can say, right, my job is to make sure whatever happens across government, we coordinate our efforts. So there is a really nasty flu virus this year, that the whole of government is prepared to do what's needed, and you can tell people you've got to do this because of X, and people will say, okay, I'll do this. But there's no national director for no deal, because no deal was never government policy. And some cabinet ministers like Phil Hammond were saying no deal would be a total disaster. I'm not going to put aside, not going to spend too much money on it, because that just encourages the loonies. Other departments led by other people who were saying, well, we have to negotiate as if we're headed for no deal. And then civil servants who work for ministers ultimately in departments having to take the line of their ministers. So you never had anything remotely coherent. That's changed a little bit, and so some of the basic planning has been done, but any sense of that's a sort of an overall strategy has been largely lacking, and I think that's why.
I mean, to what extent? So obviously from the Brexit Party side, there is in a way, quite plausible line, basically, which is, I mean, it has been the government position for quite a while now to plan for no deal and to keep no deal on the table and say no deal is better than a bad deal. And so that's been coming from the top. That's been coming from Theresa May. But what you're saying is that there's people who don't want to do that because it makes it more likely to happen. And that really is...
including probably Theresa May, who never really believed...
Yeah, so you're saying
after she said it, that no deal was better than a
But
bad
that
deal.
is Remainers who are putting their ideological
It's not necessarily
preferences
Remainers.
first.
I mean, Michael Gove has been absolutely clear ever since he got to DEFRA and his civil servants told him actually what the consequences would be for the UK food, agriculture and fishery sector of a no deal.
It's just rational,
Michael
I guess.
Gove has pretty much come out and said at every opportunity that no deal would be considerably worse than any conceivable deal he could think of. So it isn't a Remain. I don't think it is necessarily a Remain leave thing, actually.
But that could give us the worst of both worlds, right? Because you had people not planning for it because they thought
yes.
the more you plan, the more likely it becomes. But then it happens anyway, but without any plan having been drawn up.
Yes, and I think also the other aspect of things is a sort of lack of proactivity. There is this sort of view that you can get 300,000 small businesses to prepare for no deal by putting a notice on a government website which has 15 pages of bureaucraties saying this is what will happen in the event of a no-deal Brexit.
Yeah.
You should prepare. Here are some forms you can click through. And that, unfortunately, your average small business person does not do
Then that
work
comes
in
up
that
as
way.
well, because I speak to the small businesses on the high streets locally, and they'll say, we have no idea. We don't know what to do.
Yeah.
And we're not even really
Yeah.
investing because we're just in this. So
Yeah, we
that's
don't know what
happening
to
at
do.
the small business level as well. So yeah, I mean, it is a mess.
This is good. A question that makes you hostages to fortune. Matt Dodds, who will be in the big four positions in government? So we're looking at Chancellor of the Exchequer, Foreign Office, Home Office, and what's the other four? Isn't the fourth Prime Minister?
PM, Foreign Office, Home Office,
Chancellor.
Chancellor, yeah.
Yeah. So we know who's going to be the Prime Minister. Who's Home Office? Snap predictions.
No.
Anyone that
I
you...
think it might be Priti Patel.
You don't sound happy about that.
No, obviously not. I mean, I don't
Who do you think is going to be Chancellor? Who would be of the options to become Chancellor? Who do you think would be most disastrous for Britain?
I think Truss would be pretty bad.
Why?
Because she's really, I am, as an economist, I am broadly a market-oriented economist. I'm a liberal. I'm a liberal in economic terms as well as in social terms. But Truss is an unthinking, instinctive, non-empirical liberal.
I mean, I've seen her on
marketeer.
TV several times during this campaign talk about essentially just talking about trickle down, that we need to cut tax. I mean, it's completely divorced from any kind of research or evidence.
Yeah, exactly.
But then maybe that's what appeal. Is Boris Johnson? I mean, he's trying to. Interestingly, although Trump, it seems to be celebrating that people call him Britain's Trump, but there are rumors that actually he wants to show he's different to that, so he might put a woman in to be the chancellor and put a brown woman to be, Home Secretary as a kind of a very surface level way of trying to demonstrate he's not that.
All right, this is a good question. It sort of relates to what would happen after no deal. So NA asks, the EU has offered multiple billions of euros in aid for Ireland. Considering Ireland and the EU are relatively prepared, wouldn't no deal just ruin the UK's chances for a good deal?
Well, I think broadly, as I said before, I agree with that. No deal does not mean no deal forever. We cannot and will not continue indefinitely without a deal with by far our largest trading partner, so that we will go back to the negotiating table and there will be a deal, and our negotiating position will almost certainly be considerably worse as a result of...
and also,
Would it be worse, or would the EU just say, just take the withdrawal agreement now? You think they wouldn't... Would they not just offer us the withdrawal agreement again?
I mean, the thing is, right, and you'll have to correct me on this, Jonathan, is that one of the
I don't
things
think they can, sorry, because that's a quite important point. Legally, they can't. The withdrawal agreement, what Article 50 says is that once you've notified Article 50, you spend 2 years trying to negotiate a withdrawal agreement. And if that doesn't happen, you leave automatically. And what happened, so the withdrawal agreement, if we leave with no deal, the withdrawal agreement sort of disappears in a puff of smoke. And and the withdrawal agreement is subject to special provisions under EU law, qualified majority, no veto for national parliaments, bypasses a lot of the sort of complicated EU stuff that happens with the trade deal. So although we could, I mean, I think a lot of it would end up coming back, but it isn't legally possible just for us just to come back in 3 months and say, okay, sorry, we thought again, that withdrawal agreement, yeah, we'll sign it now. At that point, it no longer has any legal standing. You have to do it again from scratch through a different procedure, which is quite, which is does make our life more difficult.
I mean, it took 3 years to get here, and I mean, one thing I heard today was what at least Liam Fox has spoken about is that we won't put any tariffs on, and and that's not just the EU, that's Canada and all of the other countries that we have trade deals with via the EU. And one thing that means is that it says all of it is great for all of those countries. It says it's equivalent to say you can rent my house for now, you can have 90% of it free. Later on, you're going to have to pay for it. But actually, then they're just going to be in the house and they're going to be like, well, why would we accept anything less? So it sort of sets us up to be in a very weak position, not just with the EU, but other places. And I mean, is that right?
Yes,
right?
I mean, broadly, yes. I mean, it both messes up our deals with other countries and weakens our negotiating position, yes.
And that is a free market position to set, to push that. I mean, I don't know why they're choosing that no tariffs.
Well, because the alternative is imposing high tariffs on stuff from the EU and raising prices for people in the shops. So right. It's a very nasty, difficult trade-off.
But it's very short-term thinking, though, isn't it? Because it's like saying, well, we'll do this for now because it will just help us get through.
Well, it's also part of their line, which to say we wouldn't have tariffs. We're not going to put them up. Europe aren't going to put them up. And so then that's them saying, look, why would there be any effects of no deal if no one wants to cause the problems? But then obviously it's about regulation and harmonisation.
Well, no, but Europe are going to put tariffs on our stuff. Because Europe are not going to do what we're going to do. Europe are not going to drop their tariffs.
Other countries have said that as well.
With China, so that they can drop tariffs so then keep zero. Europe are not going to put zero tariffs on British goods. Or keep zero tariffs on British goods if that means imposing zero tariffs on goods from China, which is what it would mean. So they're not going to do that.
And we
may be able to do that, but they won't.
I mean, it undermines the membership, like being part of the group as well, right?
It's not going to.
Are there any part? I mean, this goes slightly back to an angle I was pushing earlier, but in terms of this idea that, I mean, is there any sections of the establishment that really want a no deal Brexit? And because I know. Sort of when you look at who wants Britain to be this bargain basement, which is, the Labour line they use, and to cut regulation further, cut tax further, when Thatcher came to power and there was a deregulation agenda, there was an extraordinary powerful force behind her, of business interest in the city, etc., etc. Lots of the things that a no-deal Brexit would bring about, even minus the negatives, they just seem a bit arbitrary at this point. Are there really significant business interests that want taxes to go even lower and want regulations to become even weaker? I feel like at the moment they've kind of got it all, no?
Hardly anyone I know.
I don't think businesses are driving this, which I think is quite interesting. Yeah. I think there are some individuals. I do think like the Liz Truss. I mean, I do think there are some individuals that see it as that opportunity. But what I think is that it is the political Great Britain project. For more people like Ian Duncan Smith, it's more about we'll finally be free of the EU and we're going to be Great Britain again. So I think that kind of English nationalist stuff drives some of that thinking rather than the economic project. But I think it could be a cover to get that stuff through, depending on who is driving what the economics of it looks like at that point. And so actually who's chancellor is really important.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, there are individual business people who favour a no deal, but
I think they also buy into the project of Britain is great and therefore we'll...
It's mostly for ideological rather than business interests, I think. I mean, there are very few business people who really have who real business. The vast majority of business people are pretty happy with the UK current economic model and EU membership. Of course, they complain
the status quo, right?
They complain about regulation a lot, and they complain about new regulation a lot. But it's not, the CBI don't have deregulation as number.
They're not even asking for more tax cuts. Actually,
it seems a bit arbitrary. We're going to do quick fire questions because it's too hot in here. It's 9 o'clock.
So hot.
So we'll end in the next couple of minutes. Libertarian Socialist Future asks, how will a no deal impact implementation of a green jobs revolution by Labour? Pfizer, quick fire.
It's gonna be hard because there's gonna be a lot of destruction. I mean, the thing is that Labour's not in charge, so and the Tories have no plan for a green new. So it's a hypothetical question. You could make it happen. You could invest. You could borrow loads and invest at that point. But Labour isn't in charge, so we can't make it happen.
Jonathan, Oliver Kant asks, should we be worried about a US-UK trade deal?
A bit worried in that it would be hugely asymmetric and they'd run all over us. I think it's politically undeliverable here and probably not even politically deliverable in the US given Congress and their concerns about Northern Ireland. So if it happened, I'd be worried, but I don't think it's very likely, even under Trump and Johnson.
Pfizer, Tommy Ware, question, what are the chances of Labour backing a citizens' assembly to create a Brexit consensus before renegotiating? Would it be in a snap general election manifesto?
I don't think there's a higher chance of that. I think what they'll say is that they'll essentially put on the table, which has been the Labour soft Brexit position versus Remain in a referendum. I don't think they're gonna. And why are we going to waste more time on this as well? That is the compromise position. And, Brexit is this Rubik's Cube that's like unsolvable, especially because of the Northern Ireland border. And what Labour has essentially been saying on a soft Brexit is what we can sensibly put to the people alongside Remain.
Final question, Jonathan. By Furious asks, likelihood of a Corbyn government this year?
I'd say 35 to 40%.
I like that, just putting a number on it. I mean, I prefer it to be slightly higher, but it's good putting yourself out there. Pfizer, your answer to that question?
No, I think it's completely possible, and I'm on the ground working on it. And, we've got to believe it can happen because it's really our chance. It's really our chance, whether you look at inequality, whether you look at the planet, whether you look at changing the narrative, the divisive narratives on immigration, on white working class versus other working class and immigrants. I mean, we've got to believe that we can do much better than this. So, yeah, let's have it. Let's do it.
Brilliant. Let's get out of this incredibly
so hot
sauna-like room. Thank you both so much for joining me. Pfizer Shaheen, Director of Class, and the next MP for Chinkford and Woodford Green.
It's happening.
And Jonathan Fortes, who is Professor of Public Policy and Economics at King's College London and former Chief Economist at the Cabinet Office. I've been Michael Walker. You've been watching Tysky Sour. Again, as you know, this program is only possible because of your kind support. If you are already a supporter, thank you very much. If not, please go to support.novaramedia.com and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. Please share this on Twitter, share it on Facebook, like it on YouTube. It means more people see it, and subscribe to our channel because then you will get updates whenever we go live. Thank you for your comments. Oh, actually, I was about to say I'll see you next week, but I won't because I'm taking 3 weeks off to finish my master's dissertation. So an update, Aaron Bastani will be standing in for me next week. And then after that, we're going to have a 2-week summer break because it's just too hot in here. So I'll see you in 4 weeks' time. Good night.